question of taxation touches every home in America.
Cutting through the static of the tax world, it's Simply Tax. Brought to you by BKD CPAs and Advisors. Everyone needs a trusted advisor. Who's yours? Now here's your host, Damian Martin.
Oh, hey, happy 4th of July. I was just about to pick up our good friend of the podcast, Ed Karl, Vice President of Taxation at the AICPA, to take a drive on over to a 4th of July celebration. If you recall from previous episodes of the podcast, several guests bantered about their newfound cocktail party popularity after the TCJA. Now, since I'm pretty sure Ed is the hit of pretty much every party he attends with his highly sought insights on what's going on in Washington from a tax perspective, I thought I'd let you sit in on our conversation during our drive today. Hey, Ed. Thanks for joining me for our 4th of July barbecue this year.
Absolutely.
I've been dying to ask you for an update on what you're seeing and hearing in Washington as it relates to tax legislation.
Good.
All right, let's get going.
Strap in and put the seatbelt on.
Oh, right. I got so excited I almost forgot. So, yeah, what's new in tax legislation these days?
Really, what's going on is what I've been telling people for a while. It looks like everything is headed towards some kind of a September, I'll call it a fiscal cliff that we've had in the past. September 30th is the end of the government's fiscal year. For the agencies to operate starting October 1st, they have to be funded, and they have to be funded either through separate appropriation bills. I think there are around 12 separate ones, or Congress can continue funding them through what's called a continuing resolution, or a CR. A continuing resolution is used as a temporary measure to buy some time, and it funds the agencies at the exact same levels they were funded at the previously approved appropriation bills. So the reason I say everything is coming to a head and there's a fiscal cliff, the important period for government funding, it's also around when the debt limit ceiling will be reached. It represents important funding vehicles. So those appropriation bills or the CR are vehicles to possibly consider extenders or technical corrections. I think the next way station for technical corrections as well would be September. So I think this is all coming to a head. There was a bill that was marked up, I think it was June 20th by the House Ways and Means Committee. That bill had a number of items to it. It had extenders for 2017 and 18. Those extenders that expired at 12/31/17 and 12/31/18 in there. There was a measure to change the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. There was a measure that dealt with the DOMA court ruling, which allowed same-sex marriage couples to have a joint filing status. And what this bill would do, that was considered June 20th, would allow them to retroactively amend closed years where they may have been living together but couldn't file married filing joint. And it would allow them to go back and amend those returns. I think there was also a provision that would fix the transportation fringe benefit issue for exempt organizations. I think it repeals that measure that came about during TCJA. And all of this would be paid for through changes to the estate tax exemption amount.
Speaking of the changes to the estate and gift tax, I wanted to jump in here real quick to let you know about a new way you can learn more about a common area I hear questions and confusion about, and that's estate planning. We're just getting started with the web series on our new YouTube channel called Death and Taxes, where we're combining learning about estate planning with melodramatic soap opera cliches in 2 to 3 minute short videos to help you strengthen your tax mind in an entertaining way. Check it out by searching Simply Tax on YouTube and selecting the Death and Taxes playlist. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe while you're out there so you can know when the new episodes and content are available.
So you may recall that most of the individual provisions from TCJA were temporary, and they expire at 12/31/2025. That includes the changes to the estate tax, where the exemption level was roughly doubled to more than $11 million. What the Ways and Means Committee would propose doing is making that reversal come earlier, after 12/31/2022. So what would happen is the estate tax exemption amount would drop back down to what it was when TCJA was passed. I think it was something like $5.5 million. So it would drop back down earlier. That earlier expiration of the increase of the exemption amount would raise $37.5 billion. The extenders amount alone costs $33 billion. So I think they're thinking that $37.5 billion would roughly cover all of these changes that I just mentioned to you. This bill was marked up by Ways and Means June 20th. It's not going anywhere. Any changes to TCJA are pretty much dead on arrival in the Senate. So these measures could be considered again in September.
I think that's good context to have, because I know there's so much that everyone's waiting for, I guess, in anticipation. I mean, even some of those changes, like you talked about, the changes with the DOMA decision. I mean, gosh, that was, I don't even know how many years ago, at least 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Actually, the decision in United States versus Windsor, the landmark Supreme Court case on the Defense of Marriage Act, where the court held that Section 3 of the Act was in violation of the Due Process Clause, was handed down on June 26, 2013. So about 6 years ago. Wow, does time fly.
Basically, to say a lot of things a long time coming and a lot of anticipation, but basically what you're saying is, well, September is that way station. I like how you refer to it, is maybe the next time that they might receive serious consideration. Do you think at that time that what would you say the appetite would be for maybe that legislation that was marked up or something similar to advance?
You know, I hate to say it, but it may not happen, which means I think there's a good possibility that we're going to have a shutdown. I think that, so that means extenders will go beyond October 15th. And there are plenty of people that I've spoken to. People have called me up and asked me, I have clients with provisions that expired at 12/31/17. What do I do? And I said, extend as long as you can. But October 15th basically will be extending as long as they can, or September 15th possibly. And I think what you're left with is having to file a return, having to consider in circumstances where if the provisions are not extended, you just can't take them. There's no question about that. There may be situations for some CPAs getting to September or October 15th where they feel they have inadequate guidance from IRS for some of the facts and circumstances of their clients. And in those cases, you need to consider disclosure on the return.
Want to know more about tax return positions and possible disclosure? Give episode 60 of the Simply Tax podcast a listen to hear more from Ed on the AICPA's statements on standards for tax services and key insights on taking tax return positions on gray areas of the tax law after tax reform.
And I think also for both circumstances, the extenders and the guidance question, you need to have conversations. I would recommend that CPAs have conversations with their clients about what it means and that they may need to amend returns later in the year. I have heard from some people that they wouldn't be surprised if extenders pass the fourth quarter of this year.
Wow. Yeah.
Which will be after returns are due. So it would require amending returns. I wouldn't want to file the final returns for my clients without having the conversations with them that it's still possible that extenders could pass late this year, in which case you might consider filing an amended return, and I would do that for a separate fee. I think that's what it comes down to, that sometimes clients expect that you'll fix a political problem for them without being paid. And I think that means that CPAs should have conversations over the next several months with their clients about concerns about inadequate guidance, possibly having to disclose certain issues on returns, the possibility of extenders, if they're applicable, having to amend for that later.
A lot to think about, difficult conversations for sure. And also, I mean, yeah, I guess the CPAs, and we've talked about it before, like to be able to help and provide answers. But in some cases, when there literally just aren't answers, you kind of stuck making those decisions. So, well, I guess speaking of kind of tax related legislation, I know that there was some legislation proposed, or I guess even sort of advance on the retirement front and some changes there. What are you seeing and hearing there on the Secure Act?
I think that's the same thing. I think that might wind up into September. I think I mentioned some retirement provisions, so I think a number of those got into the Secure Act, and I think that's also possibly headed for a September consideration. So all of that all lumped together, that's on my list of things following through the summer, where I again, all of these are guesses, but my educated guess is that nothing will happen this summer, and that is headed towards a September consideration. The only thing that we're going to see is the Taxpayer First Act, and that would provide a number of changes to IRS structure and programs.
Hey, Ed, sorry to interrupt, but I'm getting a call here. Hello? Yep. Don't worry. I didn't forget to pick him up. He's right here. Yep. We're on our way. Yep. All right. We'll see you soon. Bye, honey. All right. Sorry about that. My wife, Charisse, is pretty convinced I'd forget my head if it wasn't attached to me when I get excited about something. So you were just talking about the Taxpayer First Act, which was signed into law on July 1st by President Trump. That includes many substantial changes to the IRS. Is there anything that you found particularly notable about this new law?
Well, I mean, there were a number of proposals in there that we had supported individually. They wound up in that bill. There's something that we've been promoting administratively with the IRS. It's called the Practitioner Services Division. Notwithstanding the Taxpayer First Act, we're still promoting this Practitioner Services Division that would consolidate all the practitioner-facing units within the IRS right now and make them, elevate them to a division level, much like wage and investment or LB&I, that type of level, high level. And we think by focusing on the needs of practitioners, it ultimately would improve the service levels for taxpayers significantly. So we're pushing that Practitioner Services Division and still having conversations with IRS and Treasury about it.
We're on a wait and see, which kind of seemed to be a recurring theme of, the first filing season that we've had here with the TCJA. So I guess tell me a little bit about what you're hearing there and what you've been hearing from practitioners and taxpayers in terms of how that first season has gone, and maybe, what that will mean for the last remaining months that we have, for those that are on extension.
Not good news on that front. The people I've spoken to said it was the worst filing season they've ever had. We did 2 surveys that pretty much was borne out in our surveys, where respondents basically said that maybe we didn't ask the question, was this the worst or best you've ever had? But compared to prior year, and a significant number of people said that it was a more challenging filing season than the prior year. The other survey dealt with IRS service levels, and that, after increasing over the last several years, our members' response to IRS service levels had been going up. This year it did go down. The IRS indicated as such, and the National Taxpayer Advocate also indicated that service levels went down this past year, partly because of the government shutdown, but I don't know significantly. I think most CPAs that I spoke to, they didn't blame having the worst filing season ever on the IRS. They blamed it on the first full year of TCJA. And most people who indicated it was because of 199 Cap A. That's roughly what we were hearing. Extensions were up. There were some increase in penalties, underpayment of estimated tax penalties, because of the confusion over the prior year. Refunds were down. Now, the IRS data on that, where we thought the refunds would be down significantly, it wasn't down significantly on average, but I think there were a chunk of taxpayers who expected to get their normal high refund and they didn't. It's one of the reasons that we push for some penalty relief for underpayment of estimated tax. And IRS did lower it first by 5%. So the current year threshold. So when you get to April 15th, you should have paid in 90% of your liability. IRS reduced it after some conversation to 85%, but then they further reduced it to 80%, that threshold, because of concerns over confusion with TCJA. So I would suspect for the rest of this first year, unless additional guidance comes out soon, we're going to deal with the same situation. It's just going to be a challenged year. I suspect, I mentioned that extensions were up. I wouldn't be surprised if amended returns will be up over the next year or two.
Yeah, well, and then you'd mentioned, the 20% deduction, 199 Cap A specifically, and I know that was one in particular that I'll echo, kind of hearing some of the challenges there, in part because I think with the finalization of the regulations, right, as the season started and all that, it seems like it was particularly challenging, obviously, for the software companies to keep up. So yeah, I don't know if maybe that had something to do with it, that you think, in terms of just being able to comply.
Absolutely. So yes. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I heard that from a lot of people. A software challenge.
Yeah, it's pretty difficult and they were in a tough spot too, right? Because not having the guidance to be able to even base the inputs is challenging. So challenging it definitely seems to be the word I'm hearing. But maybe kind of shifting gears a little bit to another area that's been challenging for some time, cryptocurrency and some of the guidance maybe there. Or I know there was comments that perhaps we'd even see something here in June. You've seen or heard much on that, or can comment, do you think, on what we might see there?
Better look at the calendar. June's up. I think the commissioner mentioned that in the speech, maybe to the ABA. And I spoke to my staff, Amy Wong, who you've spoken to.
Amy is a tax policy and advocacy senior manager at the AICPA, who shared insights from the AICPA's Qualified Business Income Deduction Task Force in episodes 16 and 46 of the podcast. Go check it out.
She was a little bit hopeful, but they didn't hear anything specific, and nothing's come as yet. So I think maybe the commissioner was hopeful that something would be released. So if the commissioner is going to bring it up in a public speech, then I suspect that something's being worked on. And it's not at all uncommon for guidance to come out a little bit later than people internally at the service expect. Sometimes the various reviews by OMB or by Treasury take a little bit longer than they expected. So the fact that he mentioned it is good news. I think it's just going to be a little bit longer than he expected. And the answer to what you're thinking and asking is it would be good news. We've been pushing them to put guidance out. And we had a paper that we put out giving the answers to what we thought were the right answers to the questions that are on people's minds right now. So, but obviously our Q&As don't hold any authority. So until the IRS comes out with the answers, it leaves a big hole for a growing area.
Yeah, well put. I think it absolutely does. And I feel like probably the other area to cover that we've seen there's some movement on, and I know that there's also a position paper, was the taxation of the digital economy, the work that OECD has been doing. Be interested in your take on some of the developments we've been seeing there.
They had a public consultation in April or maybe earlier, March or April, and we submitted comments on that public consultation towards the end of May. And several weeks later, what we were gearing towards was the G20 meeting, where there was going to be a discussion of the taxation of the digitalization of the economy. And OECD released a work plan. And their work plan is geared towards trying to get a global consensus on a tax approach by the end of 2020. And their work plan has 2 pillars. So pillar number 1 deals with trying to update the concept of permanent establishment, which is a 100-year-old concept of using to allocate for multi-jurisdictional taxation. So mainly based on physical presence. So, for example, and this would resonate with CPAs with multi-state taxation. If you have physical presence in a state, it could be assets, it could be employees, for example, then it's a method of allocating net income to be taxed in different jurisdictions. So pillar 1 is trying to recreate the concept of permanent establishment when you have no physical presence in a digital economy, in a world that's dominated by digital transactions. And if not dominated by companies that are digital companies, probably virtually every company today has some level of digitalization, and that will only grow. So that's pillar number 1, creating a new non-physical presence method of allocating income. And the second pillar is, they have an acronym for it. They call it GLOBE, but it's a global minimum tax. So we're commenting on both these pillars. In terms of the GLOBE, the global minimum tax, we're going to be recommending an approach that adopts safe harbors and exclusions and exceptions, which is something we often do to try to reduce the complexity of proposals. But that's what's going on with OECD. We do endorse the idea of OECD leading the charge, if you will. We disagree with having unilateral action, and there are quite a few countries that have enacted some kind of temporary measure or are considering some kind of unilateral tax, a DST. So we oppose that approach. We endorse an approach where there is a global consensus on what the right solution is, and we endorse the having one group drive that global consensus, and right now that's OECD.
Very important issues, and again, I know when we spoke to Jonathan Horn about that and getting some of the insight on it, and there's been kind of getting everybody at least trying on the same page would be advantageous, it seems, from a tax policy perspective, to say the least.
I think this is maybe the hottest topic globally in tax today.
Absolutely.
And it'll grow in importance here as well. So it's something to continue to talk about.
Absolutely. Would agree. So, yeah, I know we covered a lot of ground here, Ed. What maybe haven't we talked about that's kind of on your mind or that you're seeing and hearing kind of in the conversations that you have and the policies that you're going to be focusing on?
The only other thing I would mention to you is prepare a regulation, which is still coming up. There was a bill in the Senate introduced in April, and there was a bill a week or two ago introduced in the House, which really is the first time it's coming up in the House. It was a companion bill to the Senate bill, exact same approach. And there are several things we're not so thrilled with with these bills, and we do endorse the idea of regulating preparers, and we endorse the idea of giving IRS an articulated authority to regulate preparers. They thought they had that authority based on Circular 230, and the Loving court case from several years ago ultimately showed that IRS did not have the authority. The court took a very strict reading of Circular 230, which was enacted in 1884, a couple years before the 1913 amendment that allowed a federal income tax. So basically, that 1884 Act dealt with representation, and that's what the court said. It dealt with representation. Tax return preparation is not representation. And so you don't have the authority, IRS. And Congress has to give it to you if you want to do this. So I think that's going to be continued to be discussed through the remainder of this year.
I kind of feel like the theme today here, Ed, is these things that are maybe a long time in the works and coming. So I guess perhaps that's only fitting one to throw in there as well.
It's not new. It's the case with all federal legislation. There are hundreds and hundreds of bills introduced in any particular Congress, and maybe at most around 5% ever get enacted. Very few, and some of them are must-pass legislation. For example, appropriation bills to fund government. So very little passes. It often takes years and iterations of consideration, and so you have to have a lot of patience to work in Washington. So everything that I'm talking about and bills that were considered, when we talk about tax reform and the TCJA, we started having conversations about that 7 years before it passed. 7 years it took.
Yeah. And I guess to only be 18 months in, and or maybe to have thought, I guess, to say that all the guidance, all the questions would be answered within the first 18 months is perhaps unreasonable, given that that wind up that it had to get where it ended up.
Yeah. We're a little bit unusual in that regard, we being the U.S., because I've spoken to a lot of folks I know around the world who have jobs similar to mine. They work in accounting associations around the world. And most legislation around the world is a lot more elaborated on by the legislative branches. So the need for guidance, the need for regulations and notices is a lot less severe in most other countries. And it's unusual when I describe the approach here, where we're so reliant on IRS issuing that guidance, and it's a big role for them and a big burden for them, especially when you see a bill passing in December, and the how much time it takes to get that guidance out. It's less of a problem around the world because they legislate the actual guidance, and the legislation is a lot more specific.
Well, Ed, we're almost there. What do you think? Any last thoughts?
let's visit in September. I think as Washington does, there'll be a lot of things happening, but nothing really moving, as they say here. And with the we start to move into presidential election mode, and not a lot of tax legislation passes during an election cycle, a presidential election cycle. So as we get closer and closer to election day in 2020, the possibility of any kind of tax legislation becomes less and less and less. Frankly, I think once you get into maybe the first quarter of 2020, that's about it, because you'll start to get into the primary seasons, and you just won't see it. You won't see tax legislation happening. But if I was wrong, you'll have to delete this tape.
Well, Ed and I have some barbecue and some fireworks to get to, and our drive with Ed is over for now. But obviously, the journey of understanding the tax law continues on. I'd really appreciate it if you'd leave Simply Tax a rating and review out on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts to let us know what you think. It would also be great if you drop us an email at simplytax@bkd.com to let us know what's on your mind, including ideas for future episodes of the podcast. Please get in touch with Ed using his contact information available in the show notes of this episode. And you can find me out on Twitter, where I tweet about tax at Damian Martin CPA, on Instagram, where I post about my life at the intersection of tax and being a dad at TaxDad, on YouTube, where we're sharing video content to help strengthen your tax mind, and out on LinkedIn. I'm Damian Martin. Happy 4th of July, and thank you for listening.
The information contained in this episode of Simply Tax is based on data available as of the date of its release. BKD is under no obligation to update this information if changes occur. Applying this information to your specific situation requires careful consideration of all facts and circumstances. Any information provided is not to be considered as tax, legal, or financial advice. Please consult your tax advisor before acting on any matters covered.